The ring was still in the velvet tray. That is the detail that stopped Detective Carol Sims cold on the morning of March 14, 2023, when she opened the evidence box that had been sitting on a shelf in the Calhoun County Sheriff's Archive for 4.5 decades. A narrow gold band, a small round stone, amber-colored, the shade of sweet tea held up to sunlight. It had been catalogued as a personal effect recovered from the scene in October of 1979. It had never been returned to the family. And the chain of custody log, a single carbon-copied form, faded nearly to illegibility, showed it had passed through exactly one set of hands between the crime scene and that shelf. Franklin Adder's hands. What happened in the next 6 weeks would end a 44-year silence. What happened in the next 6 minutes of this story is something the family of Loretta Mae Doss had been waiting their entire lives to hear. But to understand what that ring means and what it cost to bring it to light, you have to go back to the fall of 1979. You have to go back to Calhoun County, Mississippi, and you have to understand who Loretta Mae Doss was before the night she didn't come home. It was October in the Mississippi Hill Country, and the air had finally broken. After a summer that had pressed down on the county like a hot iron, the kind of heat that turned the kudzu dark and made the creek beds shrink to a trickle, October came in cool and welcome. The sweet gum trees along Old Depot Road had gone red and yellow. The cotton fields east of town had been stripped clean. And in the small community of Harlow, population just under 2,000, the rhythms of late autumn were settling back into place. Friday night football, church suppers, the smell of wood smoke from the houses along the ridge. Loretta Mae Doss was 31 years old. She was 5'4", slight-framed, with dark hair she kept pinned at the back of her neck during her shifts at the Harlow County Hospital, where she worked as a licensed practical nurse on the maternity ward. She had worked that ward for 7 years. She had held more than 400 newborns in those 7 years. She kept count, kept a small notebook at home with the dates and the first names the mothers had chosen, and there was not a person on staff who did not know her voice. A low, unhurried alto that seemed to settle restless rooms without any particular effort. She lived in a white frame house on Calder Street with her mother, Ruth Doss, and her 9-year-old daughter, Anita. She drove a 1974 Chevrolet Nova, pale blue with a CB radio her brother had installed the previous Christmas. She was saving for a down payment on a house of her own, 2 streets over, and kept the savings in a mason jar on the kitchen shelf. She wore a ring on her right hand. It had been her grandmother's. Amber-colored stone, narrow gold band. She never took it off. On the evening of Friday, October 19, 1979, Loretta finished her shift at 7:00 p.m. Her supervisor, Doris Haynes, walked her to the parking lot. They talked for a few minutes about a patient who was going home the next morning. Her first baby, 18 years old and terrified and wonderful. Loretta said something that made Doris laugh. Doris would remember for the rest of her life that she could not remember, later, what it was. Only that Loretta laughed too, and got into the pale blue Nova, and pulled out of the lot. She never made it home. Ruth Doss called the sheriff's office at 9:15 that night. Loretta's shift ended at 7. It was a 20-minute drive. She had not arrived. She had not called. The deputy who answered, records show it was a 23-year-old named Gary Pruitt, working his 4th month on the job, told Ruth to wait until morning. Grown women sometimes made their own plans. Ruth Doss told him she understood that. She said her daughter had a 9-year-old at home. She said Loretta had never once, in 7 years of night shifts and double shifts and swing shifts, failed to call if she was going to be late. The deputy told her to call back if Loretta hadn't come home by midnight. By 10:00 p.m., Ruth had called every person she knew. By 10:30, Loretta's brother Raymond was driving Old Depot Road with his headlights on high, windows down, calling her name into the dark. At 11:47 p.m., a passing trucker on State Highway 9 spotted the pale blue Nova half off the road, its left wheels in the ditch, its engine off. The driver's side door was open, the CB radio was still on, and on the road behind the car, scattered across a 50-foot stretch of blacktop, were the contents of Loretta's purse, her wallet, her lipstick, a small spiral notebook, a handful of coins, as though it had been yanked from her and flung. Loretta was not there. She was gone. The coins were still bright against the asphalt when the first deputy arrived. That was the detail Raymond Doss would carry for the rest of his life. The coins hadn't even rolled into the ditch yet. Whatever had happened fast. Sheriff Walt Greer ran the investigation personally. He was a careful man, methodical, with 17 years in the county. And he understood within the first 48 hours that this was not an accident and not a voluntary departure. There was a smear of blood on the passenger side door frame, a small one, the shape of a short drag mark. There were tire marks in the soft gravel shoulder that didn't match the Nova's tires. Someone else had been on that road. The list of people Loretta had encountered in the days before her disappearance was not long. She kept a small life. Her colleagues at the hospital, her neighbors, her brother's friends, the congregation at Calvary Baptist, and the people she had dealt with in the weeks following her grandmother's passing the previous summer. The attorneys who had handled the estate, and Franklin Adder, who had handled the funeral arrangements. Franklin Adder was 44 years old. He had operated Adder & Sons Funeral Home on Main Street in Harlow since inheriting the business from his father in 1971. He was a deacon at First Methodist. He served on the County Beautification Committee. He coached his nephew's Little League team in the summer. He was the kind of man who appeared at every public occasion in a dark suit, soft-spoken, his hands always folded, his face arranged in an expression of such practiced sympathy that people sometimes forgot, until they were out of his presence, that something about that sympathy had never quite felt warm. Walt Greer interviewed him twice. The second interview lasted 3 hours. Franklin Adder said he had not seen Loretta since the funeral for her grandmother in August. He provided a detailed account of his whereabouts on the evening of October 19th. He had been at a church committee meeting from 6 to 8, he said. And then he had gone home, alone. 2 committee members confirmed the meeting. No one could confirm when he had left it. In January of 1980, a hunter found Loretta's body in a stand of pine timber 6 miles east of town. She had been there since October. The cause of death was ruled homicidal. The investigation continued. In 1983, it went cold. By 1987, 8 years had passed. Ruth Doss still lived in the white frame house on Calder Street. She had kept Loretta's room the way it was, the nursing pins on the dresser, the small notebook on the nightstand, the photograph on the wall of Loretta holding Anita the week she was born. Anita was 17 by then, a junior in high school. She did not talk about her mother at school. She had learned, somewhere around the age of 12, that people did not know what to say, and she had decided it was easier to spare them the trouble. Raymond Doss drove Old Depot Road every year on October 19th. He drove it slowly, with the windows down. The case file sat in the archive at the Calhoun County Sheriff's Office. The detective who had taken it over after Walt Greer's retirement, a man named Sam Fost, retired himself in 1991. He left a note in the file that said, "Adder. Can't prove it. Should be possible." The reward poster that Raymond had put in the window of Harlow Hardware faded through the 90s, through 2 changes of ownership, until the paper was the color of old paper, and the photograph of Loretta had gone nearly invisible. Nobody took it down. The house where Loretta had been saving for a down payment sold 3 times. A family with young children lived there now. The children played in the yard in the afternoons, and Ruth Doss could see them from her porch, and she watched them, and she thought about a lot of things that she never said aloud. In 2001, Franklin Adder retired. He sold the funeral home to a couple from Jackson. He attended the closing dinner, gave a short speech about community service, and moved to a house on the lake 20 miles outside of town. His name came up, occasionally, in the conversations people had about unsolved things. It came up the way names do when there is no proof and no action possible. Not as an accusation, exactly, but as a gravity. A weight that everyone felt, but nobody could locate. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want to keep seeing this kind of work, take a second to like and subscribe. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Every one of those comments matters more than you might think. Now, let's get back to Loretta Mae Doss. Because something was about to change. By 2022, Sam Faust's note had been in that file for 31 years. Adder. Can't prove it. Should be possible. A new sheriff, elected the previous year, had launched a systematic review of cold cases with biological evidence. There were 42 such cases in the county archive. Loretta's was number 11 on the list. Then, in February of 2023, the Calhoun County Sheriff's Office received a $40,000 grant from the state cold case unit. With it, they hired a forensic investigator named Carol Sims, who had spent 12 years working DNA-based cold cases in 3 other counties. And on the morning of March 14th, she opened a box. The ring was the first thing she saw. She read the chain of custody form. She read it twice. Under the column marked collected by, it said Franklin Adder. Under the column marked released to, the line was blank. A personal effect recovered from the scene. A ring that had been on Loretta Doss's hand. That had never been released to the family. That had been catalogued by the man who, for 44 years, had been the gravity in every room. She set the ring down. She picked up the phone. She called the current sheriff and told him she needed an hour. Then she turned back to the box and kept reading. Inside the evidence bags, preserved in the cold and dry of a sealed archive shelf, was something that had never been fully processed with the technology available in 1980. A small section of fabric from the driver's side door frame. Biological material. It had been noted in the original file, collected, bagged, and stored. The 1980s had not had the tools to do anything with it. The 1990s had. The 2000s certainly had. Nobody had sent it. Sam Faust's note said, "Should be possible." Carol Sims sent it that afternoon. The Forensic Genomics Lab in Jackson returned preliminary results in 11 days. The biological material on the doorframe yielded a complete male DNA profile. It was uploaded to the combined DNA index system. No direct match was found. Franklin Adder had never submitted a sample, had never been arrested, had never been in any system that held his DNA. But forensic genetic genealogy does not require a direct match. The process works by comparing crime scene DNA against public ancestry databases. the same websites where ordinary people trace their family trees, and identifying distant relatives who share segments of that DNA, then working backward through generations to isolate a single contributor. On April 28, 2023, a match cluster pointed to a family in Calhoun and Union counties. It pointed specifically to the descendants of a man who had died in 1968, a man who had 2 sons. One of those sons had died in 2004. The other was Franklin Adder, age 87, living in a house on a lake 20 miles outside of Harlow. Carol Sims called the district attorney. She called the current sheriff. Then she called Anita Doss, who was 52 years old, who taught 4th grade in a school district 2 counties over, who answered the phone on a Tuesday afternoon while she was grading spelling tests. Detective Sims introduced herself. She said she was calling about Loretta Doss. There was a silence on the line that lasted several seconds. Then Anita said, quietly, "Tell me." The Calhoun County Sheriff's Office obtained a warrant for Franklin Adder's DNA on May 2nd. A court order directed him to submit a sample. He was 87 years old and had a home health aide who drove him to his medical appointments. He submitted the sample with no comment. He had a lawyer present. The lab in Jackson confirmed the match on May 19, 2023. The DNA from the doorframe of Loretta's Nova matched Franklin Adder with a probability that court documents would later describe as indistinguishable from certainty. The arrest warrant was signed on a Thursday morning. 2 deputies drove to the lake house. They found Franklin Adder in a chair on his back porch, looking at the water. One deputy read him the warrant. The other stood back. Franklin Adder said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I'd like to call my son." He was charged with murder in the 1st degree. He was 87 years old. He had spent 44 years as a deacon, a committee member, a coach, a neighbor, a soft-spoken presence in dark suits at every public occasion. He had handled the funeral of the grandmother of the woman he had killed. He had collected her ring from the crime scene and placed it in a chain of custody log and never released it to her family. The community of Harlow did not react with quiet disbelief. They reacted with the particular fury of people who had always known the gravity and had never been able to name it. Letters appeared in the county paper. People called the sheriff's office to say they had known. They had always felt something. They hadn't had words for it. Raymond Doss, who was 70 years old, drove Old Depot Road on the evening of May 19th. He drove it slowly. He drove it with the windows down. He did not call anyone that night. He sat in his driveway for a long time with the engine off. He was not thinking about Franklin Adder. He was thinking about his sister. The way she had laughed at something Doris Haynes said in a parking lot in 1979, and the sound he had imagined so many times and could never quite hear clearly anymore, how it had sounded when she laughed. At the time this video was produced, Franklin Adder had been charged and was awaiting trial. His attorney had entered a not guilty plea. He remained in his home under a supervision order. The ring, the amber-colored stone, the narrow gold band, the ring that had sat in a velvet tray in a sealed archive for 44 years, was still in evidence. The family had been told it would be returned to them when the case concluded. Anita Doss told a reporter from the Jackson Clarion-Ledger that she was grateful. She said she wanted to make clear that she was not celebrating. She said, "My mother deserved better than it taking this long." She said she was glad her grandmother had not lived to find out who had handled her own funeral. Loretta Mae Doss was 31 years old. She kept a notebook with the names of every baby she had helped bring into the world. She drove home with her windows down on fall evenings when the air finally broke. She had a daughter who learned to spare people the trouble of not knowing what to say. She had a ring that had been her grandmother's, amber-colored, the shade of sweet tea in sunlight. She had a whole future that belonged to her by right. Justice is a word that people use because no other word fits exactly. It is not restoration. It does not return what was taken. It cannot give Anita Doss her mother's voice, or give Raymond Doss the sound of his sister's laugh. What it does, what it did, in Harlow, Mississippi, in the spring of 2023, is refuse to let a lie stand forever. It says that 44 years of a man in a dark suit at every community occasion does not erase what he did on a Friday night on Old Depot Road. It says that a note left in a file by a retiring detective, should be possible, can still matter 3 decades later. It says that a ring in a velvet tray tells the truth even when no one is listening. That is not nothing. After 44 years, it is the closest thing to everything that remains. Before this video ends, we want to know what you think. Do you believe a case like this, with a suspect this visible for this long, represents a failure of the system? Or is this simply what the limits of 1980 technology looked like? And what does it mean that the evidence to solve this case existed in that archive for decades, waiting for someone to send it? Leave us your thoughts in the comments. This community has some of the most thoughtful conversation in this entire space, and we read every single one. Justice found Loretta Mae Doss after 44 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists, because truth, however long it takes, is worth pursuing. If you believe that, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting for you in the description below. Thank you for being here.